Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to MythVision. I have Dr. Greg Carey with me. He has a new book, Rereading Revelation. You gotta get you a copy. Link is in the description, pinned at the top in the chat. Of course, I love reading the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John. Kind of a crazy dream kind of experience. There's all sorts of really cool material in there. And I just hope anyone and everyone gets a chance to read it. For us, Dr. Carey, welcome to MythVision. Hello?
Thank you. I'm getting a delayed audio. That's why
On my end?
On mine, I'm hearing you twice. Is there something I should do to my setup?
You probably have your YouTube open.
I thought I didn't, but I might.
It's okay. At least the apocalypse isn't coming yet. So we have a little time.
There it is. I'm sorry.
No, it's nothing to apologize about. I really appreciate you taking your time to come hang out with me, because if there's one thing I love to do, it's learn from experts who study this stuff. You know the languages. You're digging into the sources. I don't know the languages. I'm hoping to get there at some point. But what's this book about? Tell us about this book. Why'd you write it?
Well, I wrote the book because I've been researching and writing about the book of Revelation for 30 years, my whole academic career. And over that time, I've addressed a lot of different topics in articles and essays. This is really, I turned 60 last month. So this
you
is
do not look 60.
what I want to say about Revelation after working on Revelation for so long.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been a passion and a focus of my research the whole way through.
Well, okay. I love the book of Revelation. There's so many interesting things we can do to approach this. You titled it Rereading Revelation. That title, if I know anything about authors, because I've been interviewing scholars like you, usually we pick things that have deeper meanings, or there's like, you put some thought into this. So why do we need to reread Revelation? I imagine that's kind of your point, is you're taking another look at it.
Yeah, there are layers, Derek. And by the way, thank you for having me here. There are layers. One layer is Revelation has its place in popular culture as sort of this icon of wild speculation about how the world will end that comes largely out of Christian circles, but from all over the place. And so I'm trying to address Revelation like, well, maybe you've heard of it, but have you read it? And at the same time, it's rereading for me in the sense that I continue to learn about Revelation. I change my mind about certain questions or gain new perspectives, or the best thing, better than those two, is asking a new question. And so that's what's going on with this book.
That should be life, right? Asking new questions, being open to new ideas. We're always doing some awesome stuff. So it looks to me, your first chapter, Rereading Revelation, as apocalypse, prophecy, and letter. If you don't mind walking a little bit through, teasing us with each section, what do you mean? What do you find in that section that you think is unique? Because, I've read, Miss Collins' work on Revelation and the mythic kind of comparison stuff. I love that kind of stuff. MythVision. And, G.K. Bill, I've read quite a few different academics with different takes on how to approach the book of Revelation. How are you approaching it here in this first chapter?
At one level, like most scholars do. So what I'm doing in that first chapter is trying to say, what kind of book are we reading here? And so someone like Adele Yarborough Collins or Gregory Beale would do that kind of work too, depending on what they were writing. Revelation is an apocalypse. The first word of the book is apocalypsis, which is like an unveiling, a revealing, uncovering. And it's a particular kind of literature that wasn't rare in ancient Judaism and early Christianity. So we have other books to compare it to. I think that's the thing that many modern readers don't realize. Revelation jumps off the page with beast and plagues and visions, right? And it's what? Well, there's other literature like that. What does it mean to read Revelation as an ancient Jewish apocalypse that's written by a follower of Jesus? Because that's largely what it is. It also addresses, it says, 7 assemblies or churches in what it calls Asia, which would be Western Turkey today, province of the Roman Empire. And it's speaking directly to those early Christians about their own circumstances, their own challenges. And this all happens in 4 verses. It also calls itself a prophecy. In other words, it's claiming that this vision, this revelation is straight from God, and you got to listen. So I'm just in that way trying to orient readers to what to expect from this kind of literature and how scholars read it.
Yeah, because there's so many different people who have different ways of approaching this. Do you think the 7 churches that they're writing to, because a lot of them aren't positive, the letters seem a bit negative.
Right.
You think these are real recipients?
I think they probably are real recipients. There are some brilliant scholars who argue this is a whole literary setup the whole way, and that John has a message for his place and time, but it's not contextualized to a particular group. You hear about those 7 assemblies specifically in chapters 2 and 3 of the book, and the setup is that the risen Jesus has something to say to each of them, and he will praise them for what they're doing well. He will scorn them for what they're not doing well. Sometimes there's a mix, but in each case, he's addressing issues that are really our best clue. If these are 7 actual assemblies, our best clue to what the circumstances are for the book.
Yeah, there's a lot in those chapters, in those particular letters, that we could spend a whole episode just dissecting. You talk about authority and authoritarianism in Revelation. Of course, I'm going to the contents here. What specifically are you addressing in this chapter?
Yeah. So one of the issues with Revelation is if it's an apocalypse and it's a prophecy, that means the author, John, is saying, I am telling you what God has shown me. It is absolutely true. At the end of the book, he says, if anybody tries to change it, they'll be cursed. And at the beginning of the book, he says, you better listen and do what you hear here. So at one level, you could say, well, that's an extremely high level of authority. I'm interested also in, I'm reading this in the United States in 2025, and we have authoritarianism in the United States, and politically and religiously. So I'm interested in how authoritarian discourse works. Some of the moves John is making are meant to counter the authority of Rome. Like when John presents Rome as a beast, he says it utters arrogant and blasphemous words. That is, it has its own authoritarian discourse that John's trying to unravel. But on another level, like a lot of people who resist authoritarians and empires, he uses the same rhetorical tools. I'm the only one who can tell you, you've got to listen to me, you have to obey. It's backed up with threats and promises. It's backed up with one of the things authoritarians love to do is demonize their enemies and use the language of disgust. And John uses a lot of disgust language to talk about his enemies and really dehumanize them. You and I are talking the day after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Right. And we're seeing the reactions that people have to that event. There's a lot of division and demonization going on in our culture right now. And obviously, I wrote the book, most of it, a couple of years ago.
Right.
But that's how it works with a book. But we could all see these kinds of things boiling up in our society. And I'm interested in using Revelation to read our own time and place, not as a prediction,
Right.
but as a way of stepping back into it and saying, what can we learn from this?
Great point. So there's a kind of a human repetition. Our behavior reflects, our cultures reflect, and authoritarian regimes reflect, or opposition to that reflect. And that we can learn from the past to see what's going on in the future, not in some necessarily divine, actual prophetic, oh, the helicopters are the locusts, that kind of stuff. So, okay, Jesus in relation to God and the Spirit. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, because I know that a lot of Trinitarians, right, they go back to the Bible, and a lot of the critical scholars that I talk to are much more like, look, I even have Christian scholars that I talk to who say, look, I go to a Orthodox church, they're Trinitarian, but I don't think Paul was a Trinitarian. They've negotiated their faith or whatever it might be in dealing with the text. Does this have any relationship to this understanding of Trinitarianism, or do you not really go into that and you specifically just deal with the relationship between God, Spirit, and Jesus?
I'm very interested in that question at that point in the book. And I am a Christian biblical scholar who reads the Bible critically and historically. So I would agree with those other scholars. The idea of the Trinity, the way we have it unpacked in Christian creeds, goes back to the 4th century. But those 4th century bishops, mostly, were trying to sort out what they were gleaning out of the Bible. And
Right.
so, no, Paul and John, the author of Revelation, probably weren't Trinitarians in the full doctrinal expression sense. But what Revelation does is it blurs the identities of God and of Jesus and of the Spirit. So that the most striking example is there's a throne in heaven that John sees. And he sees someone sitting on the throne. So we assume this is God. This is like a scene in Isaiah 6 where God is sitting on a throne.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees a lamb in front of the throne. And that's Revelation's primary symbol for Jesus. And then later, the lamb is on the throne. And the lamb is there with God on the throne. In other words, their identities get blurred. And there are even sentences where it's hard to figure out, are we talking about God or talking about Jesus?
Right.
Or who's speaking, God or Jesus? Some of that happens with the Spirit as well. And so I think what we're watching is early Christians trying to sort through. They worship Jesus. They believe Jesus is divine, and yet they're supposed to be monotheists. How do they sort that out? And I think we're seeing that. If I may just add one thing.
Sure.
Revelation does this work not as a doctrinal essay, but in poetry, right? All these crazy symbols. So it never gets spelled out. You're just like, wait a minute, what was that?
That's an interesting point, because I've had some people who they're obsessed with drugs explain vision, or drugs must explain the book of Revelation. And I'm like, no, to me, I'm reading it and it seems like a well-constructed apocalypse. This was intentionally crafted. I don't think the guy on an island was literally seeing these things. I think, it's a well-written, like you said, a poetic structure that's really probably a post-war traumatic document that may be I don't know. I was going to ask you this. Do you think it's a rolling text, or are you more of the persuasion that it's a post-war document like 4th or 2nd Baruch, 4th Ezra, or these kinds of post-traumatic texts that are trying to justify really what just happened with the Jewish people in 70? What are your thoughts?
I think it's most likely that Revelation is written in part. You mentioned 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch, 3rd Baruch, all Jewish apocalypses that are responding to Rome's devastation of Jerusalem after the Civil War. I think Revelation's likely doing that too, or written perhaps during the crisis. But probably it's in the rear view. there's a moment where John focuses on Jerusalem, right? There are two witnesses who come down, and we really don't know who they are. We really don't know what they're doing. We can guess.
Yeah.
But they're murdered there and then raised from the dead. And at the end of the book, a new Jerusalem comes down from heaven to earth, right? It's not like people go up to heaven. This city comes down to earth and God dwells there. All of that sounds like the after effects and devastation of that first Jewish revolt are on the mind of John. So, yeah, I would tend to agree with you entirely.
Yeah, there's so much interesting stuff here. Does Revelation have an eschatology? I think this is worth asking because I've been told that the Apocalypse of John has a millenarian view that seems to have continuity with, older Persian models of 1,000 years, these kinds of things. And I know that John's written later, so, who knows how long this millenarian position or tradition has passed along, but does it have an eschatology? And if you don't mind, based on your reading, what was expected to happen in that actual eschatology? Because someone could just go, it's symbolic language and the words don't mean words or something,
You asked a big question.
You have to answer it in 60 seconds. Totally kidding.
Okay, I'll try.
I'm kidding.
Lots of people in the ancient world were describing history in terms of great ages. And yes, the Persians, the Zoroastrians had kind of a systematized version, but the Egyptians could go there too, right? And some Jewish literature does too. I think Revelation's eschatology has different dimensions. So quickly, one part of it is there is a God in heaven who rules events. Ultimately, that God is going to win. There are also demonic adversaries in Revelation, right? There's a Satan, a devil, and he has an army. So that's part of the eschatology too. But the future-looking part is very hard to pull apart, tease out. Revelation envisions Satan, the beast, being completely destroyed, judged. It takes two stages. It envisions a renewed earth, right? This new Jerusalem coming to earth, where there's fresh water and fresh fruit and all these shiny, gleaming things, and God is present. It's always day. There's no crying, no death. I don't think that needs to be systematized into this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens. I don't think it can be mapped onto our timeline of history. But I think it is an affirmation that from John's point of view, and this would be in common with those Jewish apocalypses, eventually evil is done away with and peace and prosperity happens on earth. So those would be the main features of the eschatology in my view. I don't feel a need to buy into or subscribe to some detailed theory of how future events will unroll, what heaven looks like if there's a heaven. I'll just note that for Revelation, all of it happens on earth. Like there's a renewing of this earth.
That's an interesting point, because if you have an earthly theology like that, which kind of models after the prayer on earth as it is in heaven, there's this idea that he's hoping a renewal, an actual change under the likely, authoritarian regime that's in power at that time. Sounds like we have a common problem as humans. But in light of this point you bring out, I do want to ask you, because I used to be a full preterist at one point in my walk. So you know what full preterism is,
Yes,
I suspect. Do. Okay. There are people in the school of full preterism who interpret these words to not mean what they say they seem to mean. Like no more tears, no more suffering, no more darkness. They're metaphors. I mean, the moon and the stars will not give their light. That's apocalyptic metaphor. Yes. And then, the list goes on and on. So when you talk about no more tears and suffering, and you're already willing to kind of, not saying there isn't metaphoric language throughout scripture. And of course there is apocalyptic language, but like they go they want to make sure everything happened in 70 AD because they're worried about the failed apocalypse being nailed onto the early apostles or Jesus, or somebody could have been wrong. And so they make words mean other things like death, no more tears, and things like that. You would clearly disagree with that kind of interpretation.
I would. I mean, I get it. And you named why, right? It's the way of making all of this not wrong. So it all already happened way back then in some metaphorical way. And the other part is John at the beginning in the book says these things are going to happen soon. So if they didn't happen, he was wrong. Right?
Yeah.
In that way. I can deal with that. I can accept that. The Apostle Paul thought Jesus was coming back in his own lifetime. He says it a couple of times, we who are alive.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can live with that. What ancient Jews who wrote apocalypses tended to believe, because there are some different apocalypses, but tended to believe, the ones we've named, is Israel is being oppressed, God's people are being oppressed, and God is going to fix that. And there's going to be this wonderful age that might last forever. And it hasn't happened yet, Derek. So I see why you left being a preterist, right?
Yeah.
Revelation has both dimensions. It's talking about its own time and place. It thinks it's written in that crisis. I'm sure John would be surprised we're here to talk about it. But that, I think, is the book we actually have.
It might actually anchor it, like you said, some of it might have been written or it might have been constructed around the temple's demise, in light of the fact that very soon, near, Greek terms mellow, like it's about to happen. Don't seal up the words. Well, it kind of reminds me of Daniel, where we all, I think you would be in line with the critical scholarship here, is that, he's not living in the 6th century when he writes this. He's living under the Antiochus Epiphanes, the 4th Epiphanes, and you see him get everything pretty close or pretty right, and then everything wrong after that. And I like the way that John Collins, explained it, because I was going through this kind of phase, chip on my shoulder, and don't get me wrong, I'm skeptical, I'm critical, but like, I'm also like, all right, I'm a human, and these are humans. Let me hear how these humans are trying to express themselves. And John Collins said, look, they were wrong, but in a completely hopeless situation, this gave them hope. And it's almost like, if the analogy I'd paint, it's a terrible one, but it still gives you kind of the desperation of the analogy. Right. We hear about, after a decade, a girl goes missing and find out she escaped the basement dungeon of some torture from some guy who had 3 or 4 kids with this poor girl. She's completely kind of helpless under the control of someone. And so you have to imagine, cognitively, I imagine, how did she reconcile living or trying to see the glass half full and making some sense in her experience out of what punishing, horrific situation she's in? And with that, I'm going to empathize. I'm going to sit here and go, they may have been wrong, right, but I get it. And I'm sure you do too, Greg. It's a tough one,
It's, the question of hope is one I'm interested in a great deal. And, we can confuse hope with optimism. Like, I'm an optimist by nature. I don't know there's a real problem, even though the house might be on fire. In fact, actually, we had, when I lived in an apartment, a flood coming from upstairs. And I said, oh, there's no problem, until water came through the ceiling. That's an optimist, right? But hope has some sort of grounding. And the young woman you would have in mind, a prisoner of war in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Viktor Frankl wrote about it as a Jewish prisoner during the Holocaust. Hope has to have some kind of grounding. And for ancient Jews, that grounding was, this is the God of Israel. This God has created the world. He sustained Israel so far. If you think of that God as he, which they did, this God is going to make things right. And John is almost surely Jewish. He's also a follower of Jesus. And he believes, you know what? God has raised Jesus from the dead. And so surely that is a sign that God is at work. And so on the one hand, I hear you say and me say, and he's wrong about, the Romans being done away with right away, and, new heaven, new earth haven't come down yet. But is he wrong? Right? I mean, what grounds do we have for hope? And for Christians, you could articulate the story of Jesus and the story of Israel as your grounds for hope. But that doesn't mean that lots of Christians haven't died violent deaths in unjust times, and lots of people who are or are not Christians still do. It does mean that you believe that God has purposes for history and that you're committed to those.
Right. I was going to ask you about the specifically. It literally went out of my brain just now. In John's Apocalypse, I'm trying to think about what I was going to say. What do you think about I forgot it. The idea that it's Jerusalem. I mean, Revelation 17:18 seems like a no-brainer. I'm persuaded, but I'm almost just wanting to hear it from your voice so that everyone can hate you after they watch this that are full preterist. I'm just kidding. Totally joking. But there are full preterists who want to make the great city that's in Revelation 11, where the two witnesses you talked about, which is clearly Jerusalem, where our Lord was crucified.
Yes.
That's obvious, but they want to make that term for great city, and they go, well, there's another great city later on, and I'm like, yeah, but if you go to the Hebrew scripture, because it's clear that they are doing, constant, I guess you'd say, pesher, midrash, there's so much quote mining from scripture that you can find these great cities for Assyria, Babylon, Persia, like Egypt. They're called great cities, and even called harlots, non-Israelite cities that are called harlots. And so full preterists and others will try to interpret that later mention of mystery Babylon as Jerusalem. Have you ever tackled that issue?
I do a little bit in the book, but less direct. I don't focus as much on chapter 11 and Jerusalem there. But what's up, in a way, there are two dimensions of Revelation that are relevant. One is that Revelation is deeply engaged with the Jewish scriptures. Deeply engaged. So, we've talked about Daniel. Revelation's riffing off of Daniel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Psalms, all the time. The other is that what Revelation often does is it puts its big symbols against each other in a compare-contrast. So there's a lamb and there's a beast or a monster, and they have followers, and lamb has multiple eyes. They both have had mortal wounds. They receive worship. They conquer. Are you going to be a lamb person or a beast person? And in chapter 11, right, there's this Jerusalem that is being laid waste. In chapters 17 and 18, there's Babylon the Great. And you mentioned, for example, 4th Ezra, there's Jewish literature of the period that calls Rome Babylon.
Thank you.
And what's happening there is the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in the 6th century BCE. And now the Romans have done it in the 1st century CE. And it's a compare-contrast, right? So when you get the New Jerusalem, like Babylon, it's a city. Like Babylon, there are precious jewels and pearls, and it's metals, and it's glamorous and all of that. But Babylon, the first great city, is not only destroyed, it's disgusting. That's where the rhetoric of disgust might be strongest in Revelation. She's a prostitute. She's drinking blood. She dies stripped naked and devoured. Yikes. It's ugly.
Yeah.
Whereas the New Jerusalem is a bride adorned for her husband. Everything's bright and clear and pure. Even the gold you can see through, which, what does that mean? It's poetry. But that contrast, I think, is what's at work there.
I love that. You're catching these contrasts. I actually, interviewed Hugo Mendez on the Gospel of John
Yeah,
recently.
you did.
And he's doing this kind of highlighting these things I never noticed. And I mean, how many times have you and I read this stuff? And we're still finding nuggets and going, whoa, okay, that was cool.
Yeah.
I didn't realize this, which tells me, maybe if we had the blueprint for how they constructed it, we wouldn't be as blown away. But like,
Right.
it's almost like finding, they say, oh, we found a UFO ship. Now we have to like reverse engineer it. I feel like we're kind of reverse engineering this material and finding the clever nature of these authors and what they're doing. Since you mentioned the bride specifically, I think Paul mentions this somewhere too, if I'm not mistaken. What's up with this bridal language in your view? Because there's a lot to this idea. I know that the Hebrew Bible describes Israel as God's wife.
There's your answer right there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's picking up that theme from Israel. That
Got
the
you.
people of God are God's bride. The author of Ephesians, I don't think it's likely to be Paul, but if it is, uses that image for the church. The people of God are betrothed or married to God. They're the bride. And that's what is happening in Revelation 21, 22. I just add also, if you can read chapters 40 to 48 of Ezekiel, are a vision of a new Jerusalem that sounds a lot like the one in Revelation. So there's all this drawing upon antecedent sacred text going on in Revelation.
Absolutely. Before I move on to pathos, emotion, and effect in Revelation, I wanted to ask you, what kind of a relationship do you think there is between John's apocalypse and the Gospels?
Honestly, I don't know that there is one or a direct one. Some of the language and imagery in the book of Revelation connects with the Gospel of John. Describing Jesus as a lamb is a very Gospel of John. A lot of language about the word, about testifying, sounds like John. But Revelation doesn't explicitly draw on, as far as I'm aware, the sayings of Jesus in a sort of direct way from the Gospels, or the stories of Jesus in the Gospels, which isn't to say that the author of Revelation wouldn't have heard them or known them. It's just that this seems to be a different book.
Thank you. Okay. Pathos, emotion, and effect in Revelation. What's going on here?
Yeah, so I'm interested in ancient Greco-Roman rhetoric, and the speech makers, we have their textbooks, we have their school books. They said there are 3 ways to win an argument. You could win it with your own character or reputation, your ethos. You can appeal to the emotion, pathos. You can appeal to logic, logos. I left logos aside. The book's largely there to focus on how John builds his own reputation, but even more, how does John try to move the audience at an emotional or affective level? And part of that chapter is I'm engaging a fairly new development in cultural theory and biblical studies called affect theory. And I am not an expert in it. I don't swim in it. But one thing I've learned is that a lot of what we think we're doing that motivates us happens at a level deeper than we even realize. And that's what affect is getting at. So how does John achieve these effects, or try to? We have to guess, right? We're looking at a book, not
Right.
the ancient readers, not the authors. But how does it appeal to those deep levels of human stuff?
Got to get this book. Wealth and Poverty in Revelation. What's going on here?
A lot in Revelation. So, when we see the prostitute and we see the New Jerusalem, a lot of reference to wealth, but also the beast, right? Controls. You can't buy or sell unless you have the mark of the beast and the number of its name. In the 7 letters, John talks to churches and he says, you think you're poor, but you're actually rich. Conversely, you think you're rich, but you're actually poor. So some kind of economic critique of Rome is happening in the book. John lists in chapter 18 when Babylon is destroyed, all the people who mourn, and one of the group is merchants, and it gives this cargo list, chapter 18, verses 12 and 13, of all the luxury goods that Rome trades in. And it's like, look, Rome exploits people, it's violent, it's blasphemous, and it's coming down. I'm drawing heavily in that chapter from a fairly new book by a scholar in Louisville, and I should always double check my pronunciation of her last name, Anna Bowden or Bowden, who took it. This is her own work. I had never met her, but for years I've asked students, imagine you're a stonemason living in Ephesus, and what does John's message mean? You don't get to worship any of the local gods in Ephesus, and you're a stonemason. Well, can you go to the stonemasons' meetings? They're going to offer a sacrifice to the gods and sing some hymns. If you don't participate in all that stuff, are you going to starve? Are you going to lose your social network? Are you going to lose your family? Well, she did it as a research project and investigated the lives of stone workers in Ephesus. And essentially argues that what John is really asking them to do is social suicide, which could be real suicide. That is, to abandon all the sources of income and security they have. John seems to want to say, this is something all readers of Revelation get. He wants to say, you can't participate in any of the worship of any of the deities other than the God of Israel. Just can't. And the ancient world was a very religious world. And at the same time, he's also saying, and you can't participate in that whole imperial system.
That's tough.
Like with Babylon, it says, come out from her, my people.
Mm-hmm.
So what would that exactly mean if we decided that, investment plans for your retirement were thoroughly corrupt, and maybe they are, and we said, well, we're just not going to participate in the banking industry?
That would be not easily done. I don't know how. In fact, I did a video a while back, like a documentary on this, just trying to cover the kind of coins that might be being, because there's certain ones. There's like these certain coins. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. It's been like a year since I did the video, where it seemed that in the region of Palestine, they usually had imageless coins that they would allow to circulate. And I can't remember what exactly the name of this coin, but it started to seep within these communities that seemed to be problematic for Jews, that were like, hey, these images, kind of like going back to the Maccabees, right? You could see archaeology when imageless coins start to pop up that are not against Torah. And it kind of makes me think there's something to that. And the fact that he says taking it on your right hand and forehead, we know that has biblical language for the law and being righteous and stuff. So I can't remember the name of the coin off the top of my head, but you get where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I do. And the setting here is Roman Asia, right? Mm-hmm. Where the local cities and their elites are constantly competing to demonstrate their loyalty to Rome and to get recognition from the Roman Senate. And so they will literally send delegations to Rome. Can we build a temple after the emperor? Can we build a temple to Nike, victory or conquest? Can we have a festival? They're doing this all the time, almost like, can we have the Super Bowl or the Olympics? Trying to gain status, get business, build relationships. And John is writing into this context saying you can't have a part in these things.
But how? Okay, so I know there's a lot of post-traumatic stuff that we could say, like with war, like in Asia Minor. How bad was it for these guys, or were they potentially? And I'm not trying to be like judgmental of the mindset of apocalypticism, but we meet modern apocalypticists and we go, they're nutty. Some of them are extreme, and it's like they're outside society, or they're culty. They have a cult. Like, can we look at John's letters and potentially these churches and think they're really going too far? It's a bit much. Something's wrong here.
That's the question I'm really wrestling with personally. John is some kind of extremist. He's not a violent extremist.
Right.
He doesn't call people to do violence. His image for Jesus is a lamb who has a sword coming out of his mouth, right? It's his words.
He has visionary violence, but not he himself.
Lots of fantasy violence.
Right.
No question. And what he's asking from people is a whole lot. And as a contemporary Christian, I don't think our job is to download the message of Revelation and try to live it out.
Right.
I don't think that's true with any of the Bible.
Thank you.
But I think our job is to read Revelation and be in this kind of dialogue. Like,
right.
When are those moments when, if you're a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, you have to truly plant your feet, be willing to not compromise and risk everything for what you believe is true? And we can go back then and start naming the moments when we look back to the Christians who have done that. During the civil rights movement, there were the freedom rides, where people tried to integrate the South by riding buses into Alabama and Mississippi. And the people down there said, you will die if you do this. And, a bus gets firebombed and people dragged off and beaten, and how no one died, right? I don't know. Twice they had violent incidents that stopped. This group of students at Tennessee State University, a historically Black school, had said, we can't support these freedom rides. It's stupid, but now we have to go down. We can't let this happen. And I'm trying to imagine this. It happened. These college students, the night before they go down, writing their wills and signing them. Right? When are those moments when compromise, moderation, negotiation are broken? And I'll just note, one of the books on Revelation that's influenced me the most is by Alan Bozak, who was an anti-apartheid activist, Black clergy person in South Africa, imprisoned, tortured. And he has this line in his book, and now I'm forgetting the name of the book. I'm sorry about that. But Alan Bozak, the line is, if Christ's blood cloak is splattered with blood, as it is in Revelation, it's the blood of his enemies and those who oppress his children. And I just think whatever critique I have of Revelation, its violence, its desire for revenge, am I going to say that out loud if Alan Bozak is at the same table?
Right.
And that's where I just have to hold open that there have been those moments when people, not just Christians, but I'm reading it as a Christian, have faced those kinds of struggles. And I can't judge whether John's moment is one. It kind of doesn't look that way to me. But there have been those moments. And Revelation's the only book of the Bible that addresses it that way.
Right. I see what you're saying. Like, it's almost like a book you can refer to in those kinds of circumstances or similar types of trials and tribulations in your life, where you can glean something there that gives meaning, gives purpose and hope. We can do that. And I think that negotiation with the text, even if you're not a Christian, to look and say, hey, there's something about, dealing with this oppression that we're under, there's going to be light at the end of the tunnel, or hope that there's going to be light, these kinds of things. It's unfortunate that some negotiate the text in the opposite direction and find text, kill every man, woman, and child, or crazy stuff that, that's the unfortunate part, where justification for these things. But I can get on board, with everything what you're saying. I'm sure you agree with me on that comment too. A queer book.
Yeah.
What is going on with this?
Yeah. I am interested in queer hermeneutics. I'm straight.
Is it like in the vein of feminism, the feminist interpretations too?
It is. It's in conversation with feminism, but what I'm doing is drawing upon the work of people who do queer hermeneutics more full-time than I do, which is not much, dabbling, but what are they teaching me about Revelation? And in that way, I'm kind of reporting. There's not so much that's brand new there, but there is a lot about gender in Revelation that is troubling and interesting and remarkable. So troubling, whenever Revelation uses a female symbol, it's always determined by, is she promiscuous? Is she a prostitute? Is she a mother? Is she a bride? Right?
Right.
And the sexualized violence is just loud when it happens in Revelation. Those things are true. But there's also a reference to the followers of the Lamb, and it says, and they have not defiled themselves with women. Well, that's a weird way, right? I mean, are they averse to women? Are they ascetics? What's defiling about women? That's not your conventional Jewish outlook, right? Jesus is described, as this gleaming Son of Man in chapter 1. And he has a something around, it doesn't say his chest, his breast. And, when you look at the Lamb, when the Lamb is revealed, you were told to expect a lion. In fact, I'm thinking about this Twitter thing I saw a few years ago while we were shut down for COVID, that the essential image was Christians should be like this band of lions and not like these sheep. And it shows sheep with masks, COVID. And I'm thinking, but wait a minute, Revelation went lamb, right? I mean, it says you're going to see a lion. You never see a lion. Jesus is a lamb who has been wounded, slaughtered. He is not this fierce, masculine, overwhelming presence. That's not how he achieves his victory in Revelation. He achieves his victory by dying for the truth. So I think there's a lot going on in Revelation that undermines maybe some of the assumptions we would make about masculinity and femininity.
Right.
And to me, what's at stake for me? I grew up in Alabama at a certain time and place. If you wanted to be a real guy, you played football and you had to be this and that. Man, that generates a lot of squirreliness in your life as you get older. When you find out you can't whip every problem you face, and you need to find other ways to be resilient, and you learn that women can tolerate more than you can as often as not, and more often than not. And just noting that these things are going on in Revelation, they're not made up. They're there in the text to explore. That's what's going on in that chapter.
Yeah. It's like we have blind spots when we're reading this, the 100 times we did in our years in the past. Then you're like, you hear someone who has a way of drawing something out you never noticed. And there's like, oh, I never thought about that. We've always talked about the mystery Babylon. She's the prostitute on the dragon. And you're like, but I never really stopped to ask the question, why prostitute? Yeah. Not just the fact that, what does that entail economically, religiously, and then even just sexually, right? And why that term? That's the quickest way to destroy someone's reputation, right? Is to easily do this and dehumanize the other side. And but yeah, there's so much there. And I was going to bring up there's a moment, Bart Ehrman, I did an interview with Bart Ehrman, and he highlighted this, but he's not the one I think that noted this. I read it somewhere else. In one of the letters to the churches, there's a pretty messed up scene where it's like they laid a woman down. A lot of people
on a bed.
They say that it's a sick bed, but he's like, no, pretty much someone ends up forcing themselves on her, force her to be pregnant, and then the child is taken from this world.
Yes.
Yeah. And like Jesus, according to some of them, is behind this somehow. Like this is punishment.
It's a threat.
Yeah. What the heck? That's pretty.
You can't dodge the misogyny. I think Bart does read it that way. I do too. The scholar along these lines I've learned most for is Lynn Huber, who has a big feminist commentary on Revelation that's just a couple of years old now. And Lynn directly employs queer theory as she engages some of these things, but it's also feminist, right? Is this the kind of language we need? I would note even today, I don't know if you picked up on this, but there's a movement within American Christianity that refers to their political opponents as Jezebel.
It doesn't shock me.
No, they talk about exorcisms of the spirit of Jezebel.
Oh, I think I know.
Yeah.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
It was applied to Kamala Harris, excuse me. And so this stuff has relevance now. Is this really the kind of language that we want to bring into our contemporary discourse that is so violent and violent in a sexualized, misogynistic way?
I have a friend who left a cult that somewhere in Texas where they cast out demons and they do all this. They're kind of a Calvinistic, speaking in tongues. And one of the teachings that they had was a Jezebel doctrine. They called it the Jezebel doctrine. And it was about making your wife submissive. And the list, if I listed it all to you, and like, it's like, ultimately she's your slave and she must obey her master. And like, it's on a whole nother level of extreme force in that relationship. And if she doesn't do it, then as a husband, you have every right to, punish or dismiss her and move on, or, this is how they treat them. And I was pretty shocked to hear it when he described it. So
it's not a minor movement.
Really?
No, it's not. And there's a whole literature about the submission of women, women who complain about abuse. And then the husband says, well, I'm sorry, being told to reconcile and go back and endanger themselves and their children again. And could I just note, Derek, that what I love about this is what I mean by rereading Revelation, right? That there's the scholarly back then.
Shameless plug.
Thank you. I'm shameless. There's this scholarly, historical, literary way of reading Revelation that I'm committed to. But then what do we do as readers in our context? And you and I, finding these threads that make connections and relevances, that's not in Revelation, but it is.
Right.
And that's the conversation I want to have.
Thank you. Violence and the bloody lamb. I feel like you kind of touched this. Yeah. We've already emphasized that. I'll just skip that one to go to mapping resistance and Revelation.
Yeah.
What is that chapter about?
It's very popular, has been for 30 years or so, to talk about the New Testament or the Bible in general as anti-imperial resistance literature. I'm sympathetic to that, but I always want to ask, well, what exactly do you mean by resistance? And in Revelation, like, one option would have been, well, if you don't like Rome, why not try to fight them? I mean, it would have been a disaster, but it's been done. People have done it. John doesn't ask for that. John does ask for certain kinds of behavior that are essentially, almost the Amish Mennonite pattern. Just get out, just do your own thing, don't participate. There's that. But there's also literary resistance. And literary resistance means, and I think this is part of what it means to be an apocalypse or a revelation, is to say, what does Rome say it is? And let's pull the veil away. What is Rome? So Rome says it is glorious. Rome says it's victorious. Rome says it's righteous. Rome says you should kneel in front of Rome. Revelation says it's a monster. It's murderous. It's arrogant. It's blasphemous. It's a prostitute. It's drinking blood. It's exploiting people, enslaving people, degrading the environment. There's a lot of that kind of imagery in Revelation. Revelation's almost, if you can imagine walking through this ancient city where there are great temples and monuments everywhere on narrow streets, and you could just say, wow, like I'm still a yokel in New York. Wow.
Right.
And Revelation's trying to say, you should be disgusted when you look at this. You should want no part of it. If you really understood how all that stuff gets built and what it means for ordinary people and what it did to Jerusalem, you would not want any part of this. And so it uses disgusting language like monsters and blood and filth and nakedness and vulnerability and death to talk about Rome through its primary symbols. That is a form of resistance literature.
There's so much there. Oh, there's so much there. Look, ladies and gentlemen, rereading Revelation. I sincerely appreciate you, Dr. Carey, coming in and explaining the new book. Get it on Amazon. It is far deeper and it goes through way more material than what we covered. But I wanted to give people an outline of what to expect and why they should go get a copy of the book. Is there anything you'd like to say as we wrap up this episode?
I want to thank you for doing so much amazing homework and for giving me the chance to have this conversation. I would encourage anyone who approaches Revelation or other parts of the Bible, be curious. Just be curious. And thank you.
Thank you. I hope to have you back again sometime. I want to say thank you also coming in with that, that humble, let me negotiate and understand. You're understanding where I'm coming from, and I'm understanding where you're coming from. And it's cool to hear someone who is identifying as a Christian and me, who's a skeptic, who's no longer a Christian, find common ground and be able to negotiate, right, with what we're looking at, find value in this stuff. Like I can read an ancient Greek text and be like, I don't think Heracles is real, but there's some lessons here. There's something deep about what Heracles just did in that trial, one of his 12 laborers or whatever, that I learned from. And that's just, I'm just throwing something at the wall, but you know what I mean? Like
I do know what you mean.
We need these kind of conversations more, especially right now. Absolutely, wow. Derek. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Seriously, if you appreciate this episode, you like the content, grab a copy of the book. I sincerely appreciate it. Share this out with people so they have an idea of what's going on. Take the time to reread Revelation with the cues this book kind of gives you. And again, thank you, Dr. Carey. My pleasure. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland. And I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth. Nothing more.